Hello everyone, welcome back to Exploder. You know the deal, let's get to the topic. During the Monday Night Wars and wrestling in general, for years, there were three major companies. If you asked Eric Bischoff, there were two major companies and some jackasses in a bingo hall. Not the point. There was the WWF, WCW, and that little plucky upstart that could, ECW, in probably the bad part of Cracktown in South Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. But during that time, there were a lot of people going back and forth between WCW and the WWF. Wherever the money was, wherever the dates were better, wherever the fans were, what have you. Now, many talents juggled back and forth between WWF and WCW during the 90s. Whether it's Jeff Jarrett, or the Godwins, or Jeff Jarrett again. You get my point. But there's a select few people, from all the people, the hundreds of people that worked for one of these companies, or both, during the 90s, there was a select few that actually worked for all three companies. These are the people I call the Three Peters. These are the people that wrestled all three companies, or appeared in all three companies at some point or another. So, some of them are pretty obvious. Like, clearly, Raven is very obvious. He was Scotty the Body, Johnny Polo, Raven, sort of went back and forth, went to WCW again, back to WWF, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to talk about him because, quite frankly, it's very obvious, everyone knows. I'm going to talk about the ones that went through all three companies that you might not think about. And it might jog some memories, it might be some obscure crap you've never heard before. That's my job. So I'm going to try to give you a little bit of both and see what you think. So this is a compilation of the Three Peters, people that worked for the WWF, WCW, and ECW during the 1990s. We're going to start it off with a very surprising one, Luna Vachon. Luna Vachon started in the WWF from 1993 and worked there till 1994, being the main squeeze of Bam Bam Bigelow, because quite frankly, if you ever looked at Luna Vachon, on purpose mind you, but if you looked at her, she looked like the person who would fit with a guy with tattooed flames on his head, because it makes sense. After selling the services of Bam Bam Bigelow to the waning days of Ted DiBiase's $1 Million Corporation, she left and joined ECW, where she joined up with Tommy Dreamer to fight against Raven and his Nest. And she did what a lot of people did in ECW at the time, beat the crap out of Stevie Richards. She would then go to WCW, mind you, WCW, my mistake, in early 97, where, at this point, Medusa, the former Alundra Blaze, had been drawn to WCW on the promise, supposedly, don't crucify me, Bischoff, supposedly of building a women's division. Now, this never happened, of course, although she did get to hang out with Macho Man Randy Savage and beat up an announcer with barbecue sauce, so just as good, right? Anyway, in early 97, Luna Vachon came into the company and would work numerous matches with her former rival, Alundra Blaze, aka Medusa Miceli. Now, no matter what happened, Luna Vachon would dominate the matches. However, Medusa would always pull out the win, and the rest of the women's division in WCW was Patty Stonegrinder, remember her, and Medusa versus Akira Hokuto from now until the end of time. So that worked out. The WWF brought Luna Vachon back in 1997, where she was put with the newly reformed Goldust, who started wearing ball gags and dressing up as the Christmas trees, don't ask, which was, again, a great pairing of the two, and she would actually be there through 2000 before she was finally let go. So again, this is someone who spent time in all three companies, had an impact in all three companies, and that's pretty interesting if you really think about it. Moving on to another one, a big name, an actual big name in the business, nothing against Luna Vachon, but a huge name in the business, a guy who's held the belt in both of the federations I'm mentioning, WCW and the WWF. It's Sid. Whether he's Sid Vicious in WCW or Sid Justice in the WWF for some reason, Sid has been all over the world. He worked for WCW as part of the Skyscrapers. He would then go to the WWF and be almost handed the Hulk Hogan spot, but it turns out one problem. Sid loves softball. I'm not kidding. He loves softball. Ask anybody. Like, it's like a job. Like, he loves it more than most of us love anything. Softball. I don't get it. He then, after a disastrous match with Hulk Hogan, in which Sid is the first one ever to kick out of that leg drop because interference got mistimed, you know the deal, he would then go back to WCW, where he would eventually get fired for, and I'm not kidding here, stabbing Arn Anderson with a pair of scissors because it's professional wrestling. He would then go back to the WWF and be the manager for Shawn Michaels, because if there's anybody you want as a bodyguard, TV or not, you want the guy who will stab Arn Anderson. Good job. He would then leave again. He would then come back again. He would become WWF champion, beating Shawn Michaels in a short program between Survivor Series and Royal Rumble, which was supposed to garner support for Shawn Michaels as a champion, and he would lose the belt back. He would then disappear again, and I believe he would win the belt again, lose it to The Undertaker at WrestleMania, and then disappear again. He would eventually he would disappear from the industry for about 2 years, oddly enough, and then he would show up in ECW, where his biggest moves were a powerbomb, chokeslamming John Cronus through a table at ringside, and wondering where the hell his money was. Those were his 3 moves. He then went back to WCW and finished out what looked like to be the rest of his actual career as being the guy who was known for funny promos, intense screaming, and that one time he jumped off the middle rope and broke his leg in half. Maybe sometimes working in 3 companies ain't such a good idea. Then, of course, there's the Steiner brothers, Rick and Scott Steiner. Now, this is, mind you, before Scott became the giant roid rage monster we know today. He actually looked like a regular guy from Michigan. Mullet and all. That's right, take that, Michigan. Rick and Scott Steiner was actually one of the premier tag teams of the day. Did very well and wrestled all over the world, including Japan. They started careers, of course, in the NWA, which became WCW. They would again go to the WWF for about a year, would win the tag team titles, would become feud with the Quebecers, and then at a time they just, for whatever reason, they weren't getting over. Honestly, the WWF wasn't really building them because, this is around the time where we're talking about Vince McMahon on trial for steroids and maybe going to prison. So maybe the Steiners isn't his biggest focus. I don't know. The Steiners would actually make appearances in ECW very briefly and then make their way back to WCW, where of course Rick Steiner would be known as the guy who could knock out anyone, and Scott Steiner would become a walking case of roid rage, potential lawsuits, and promos that are so incomprehensible, they're somehow good. Another one that might surprise people, a guy who went to Japan but also appeared in all 3 companies, Bam Bam Bigelow. Bam Bam Bigelow worked for the WWF on 2 separate occasions. He worked back in the 80s for a short run. He was in the World Title Tournament at WrestleMania 4, of all things. He then would disappear, he'd go to Japan, team with Vader, come back, worked the WWF for a few years, did pretty well for himself, was in a main event WrestleMania match, making Lawrence Taylor look credible when he's not on cocaine or doing underage hookers. Yes, I said both of those things, and both of those things are true. He then would get released from WWF in 96. He would go to ECW, become part of the Triple Threat with Chris Candido and Shane Douglas. He would stay there until 1998, including winning the TV title from Taz. He would stay there until 1998, where he would, like many people, get signed by the behemoth that was WCW, where he would immediately come in looking for Goldberg. He would immediately lose to Goldberg, and then became more of a, not say comedy, but a hardcore wrestler for the remainder of his time in the company. Then another one, this one really surprises me. This is one, if you really think about it, this is really surprising. And it's one that I don't think a lot of people know about. Scott Hall. Now, everyone knows Scott Hall from WCW. Everyone knows Scott Hall when he was Razor Ramon in WWF. Now, he started in the 90s. We was talking about the decade of the 90s. He started in the 90s as the Diamond Stud in WCW in the early 90s, being managed by, of all people, Diamond Dallas Page, with his own partner, Vinny Vegas. Yeah, I wonder what happened to him. He then would get picked up by the WWF and become Razor Ramon, a slow-talking ripoff of Al Pacino and Scarface. There's a lot of layers there. He would then go to WCW because that's where the big boys pay a lot of money to get you. I don't think that was the phrase. Anyway, he worked for WCW from 1996 until October of 2000, when they just fired him. Now, mind you, he hadn't been on TV in months at this time because he was busy having his life fall apart. To be fair, I'm glad he's doing better now, but this time it was a nosedive. He would then make a few appearances for ECW in 2000, facing such luminaries as Big Sal. Yeah, I don't even know what to say there. Non-televised matches, mind you, so take that for what it's worth. Then an All-American, Ron Simmons. Ron Simmons worked for the WCW from 1987, when it was still Jim Crockett Promotions, until 1994, which was well into the Eric Bischoff era. He was even the world champion, the first black national world champion. In 1994, he would leave the company. He would go and work for ECW for about a year. 1994-1995, Ron Simmons, being Ron Simmons, wrestled for ECW. Nothing to write home about, but he was a decent talent, good enough for the ring. Why not? He then would go to the WWF, put on a Spartan helmet for some damn reason. They call him Farouk Assad, and he would turn that into a career from 1996 to 2004. I don't even know what to... He wore a Spartan helmet, and his name was Farouk Assad. Now, mind you, this became the Acolytes and the APA, and he turned it into something, but if you told me in 1996 that Ron Simmons was going to come in, put on a blue Spartan helmet, wear what looked like a Spartan-type kilt, I don't know, skirt, whatever you want to call it, be managed by Sonny, and you're telling me he'd be employed in 2004, I would punch you in the face. I probably wouldn't punch you in the face because I don't know what you look like and I'm not much of a fighter, but yeah, he turned it into the APA and he made a good career of it and you can't blame the guy. But yes, another guy who worked all three companies. Really surprising. Now this one's gonna surprise a lot of people. A lot of people. I can't even believe I'm saying this sentence. The Insane Clown Posse appeared in all three ECW, WWF, and WCW during the 90s. The Insane Clown Posse. The Insane Clown Posse. Okay, Shaggy 2 Dope and Violent J. This is how you know the 90s were messed up. When their album was being banned from Walmart and Disney radio stations, or radio stations owned by Disney, whatever the hell it was, the Insane Clown Posse appeared at the ECW's second pay-per-view, Hardcore Heaven 97. They were summarily had the crap kicked out of them by Rob Van Dam and Sabu because it was still ECW. They would then turn that into a gig in WWF in 1998, where they would join the Oddities, a giant guy who had a Cartman doll with a mask on, a 7'8" guy from Argentina, Kurgan dancing his way out of the business, Luna Vachon, so on and so forth. Of course, you're going to put two rapping clowns with them because why not? After the Oddities thing died down very quickly, they were released, and they ended up in WCW, joining up with Vampiro and very shortly Raven in a group called the Deadpool. Ryan Reynolds was nowhere involved. Then, as Raven left the company, it was reformed into the Dark Carnival, where they would recruit other misfits, the Demon, Dale Torborg, the Kiss wrestling hybrid that no one wanted, and for some reason, the Great Muta, because WCW had no idea how to use Great Muta after 1989. I don't know. Yeah, those three worked for all three companies during the 90s. That's just baffling to me. Getting to the more traditional, Dr. Death Steve Williams. That's another name that really makes you wonder. Dr. Death Steve Williams worked for WCW from 1988 to 1992, feuding against the Varsity Club, Kevin Sullivan, and the like. In 1997, after a stint in Japan with Terry Gordy, as the Miracle Violence Connection, where they just basically destroyed Japan like Godzilla was real, they made an appearance in ECW, taking on the Eliminators in what will truly go down as possibly a war crime. Steve Williams would actually face Raven, and then lose in 1997. He would lose a match by pinfall, which would be his only pinfall loss in a decade. Dr. Death Steve Williams was undefeated by pinfall in North America from 1987 to 1997. Think about that. Coming off his success in Japan, the WF brought him in 1998 to put him in the Brawl for All, thinking he's going to be the biggest star. They're going to run him in the Brawl for All. He's going to win as a legitimate fighter, and he was a legitimate tough guy, make no mistake. He was then going to immediately get put into what was eventually going to become a program with Steve Austin. Well, that didn't work out in that he got eliminated by virtually unknown or uncared about Bart Gunn, who had just come off a rousing set as part of the new Midnight Express. That's always good. He was then released because basically the buildup was gone. Once you get knocked out by Bart Gunn, who then gets knocked out by Butterbean, Steve Austin's like a bridge too far at that point. He would then go to WCW in 1999, where his gimmick involved wearing a Hawaiian shirt and standing next to Ed Ferrara as he made fun of a guy with Bell's palsy. Great job there. And that would be the end of his career in the mainstream North America. Another more bizarre collection of people that have worked for all three companies, PG-13. JC Ice and Wolfie D, also known as PG-13, were a part of what was really a weird period of time. They were part of the Nation of Domination before it became a smaller group involving The Rock, Mark Henry, and the like. It was I don't know if you're going to get this reference or not, but a Benetton ad of people. You had Puerto Rican Savio Vega, you had the white prison tattooed Crush, you had Ron Simmons, still as Farouk for some reason, and then you had the White Boy Rappers, PG-13. They would work for them, including being part of a brawl at WrestleMania 13 in March of 1997. In August of 1997, they also would appear at ECW's second pay-per-view, Hardcore Heaven 97, where there would be in a losing effort to the Dudley Boys. They wouldn't last long. They'd have a couple matches and then they'd disappear, because what essentially happened was JC Ice has an ability to open his mouth and then say dumb things to the wrong people. He apparently got him fired from WWF for running his mouth. He then, only making a couple appearances in ECW, got kicked out of ECW's locker room for running his mouth. And then a couple years later, they would actually go to WCW and wrestle a few matches. So these two, I don't know, misfits, I hate using that word, but that's pretty much what they were, wrestled in all three companies in the 90s. That's sort of a weird thing for two guys from USWA, from Memphis, who ended up working for all three companies at some point during this decade. That's just interesting to me. This one's a little more obscure, a little more not as well known, I guess, but Devon Storm. If you don't know who Devon Storm is, do you remember WCW in the 90s? Who am I talking to? Anyway, if you are listening and you think this is a conversation, seek help. But WCW in the late 90s, early 2000s, right before they burnt down, they had a guy named Crowbar. Crowbar's long hair, the beard, and he teamed with Daphne and David Flair when he was acting crazy. The guy behind that was an independent wrestler named Devon Storm. Now, Devon Storm would appear for the WWF actually in the much heralded WWF light heavyweight tournament. He would actually face his partner at the time on the indies, Ace Darling, in a match and neither man was really a high flyer, so it was sort of weird that they were in the light heavyweight tournament. Well, whatever. He would then make appearances as Devon Storm in ECW before WCW got a hold of him and made him into Crowbar, who it's called that because he was carrying one and they found him at a gas station. That counts as the backstory for WCW. So, yay. Another one more well known, but also a very interesting situation, Too Cold Scorpio. Too Cold Scorpio started in the early 90s working for WCW, teaming with Marcus Alexander Bagwell. Years before Buff became the Stuff, and even more years before Buff became a gigolo, Marcus Alexander Bagwell teamed with Too Cold Scorpio in what was basically a decent tag team on WCW Saturday Night before Nitro became the flagship show. But of course, Too Cold Scorpio and Marcus Alexander Bagwell didn't quite get along, did they? And if you don't believe me, ask Too Cold Scorpio what he thinks of Bagwell. Oh, get ready for the curse words. He would then go to ECW, win both the ECW TV Championship and the tag titles at the same time, teaming with, of all people, the Sandman. He was referred to as Two Gold Scorpio, which is actually, if you think about it, pretty clever. And then WWF would hire him and make him Flash Funk, as some kind of futuristic pimp who I'm pretty sure was colorblind. If you don't recognize the gimmick, it's the same gimmick that they would add 200 pounds to and give to Brodus Clay about a decade later. Progress. And then, while working for WWF, at one point he actually went back to Too Cold Scorpio, as the Flash Funk thing died it should have been a quick death, but it was actually drawn out. Like, they were fighting over how long he was in the coma. He's gonna make it, and he was Flash Funk for way too long. But anyway, he became Too Cold Scorpio, and at one point, while still working for the WWF, because he wasn't released until 1999, he actually made a couple appearances in ECW, facing off against Rob Van Dam in a very, very good pay-per-view match. Tag matches against Sabu and Van Dam. So he was actually appearing in ECW and the WWF at the same time before being released by the WWF in 1999 up to what he's basically said was his fault. So yeah, again, there's another one that's more well known, but still, it's really interesting that he was able to work on all three, and he worked for two of them at the same time. And then, of course, there's the sadder ones. Of course, there is the case of Louis Spicoli. Louis Spicoli started in AAA in Mexico as Madonna's boyfriend. A very interesting name, but a very talented guy. That would get him a job in the WWF, working as Rad Radford, which was the WWF's view of grunge. I don't know. It looked kind of like grunge, but also kind of looked like a prototypical, like, what an adult thought a kid dressed like. If you ever see that, it just, I don't know. I'm not even gonna, whatever. Anyway, he would then leave the WWF because, quite frankly, with all due respect, he had a huge drug problem. He would go to ECW, work for a while, becoming a thorn in the side of Tommy Dreamer, a flunky of Raven, and then, like many flunkies of Raven, he would be given a WCW contract. He would work for WCW until his unfortunate death due to an overdose of drugs. And there's no joke about that. I mean, it was a guy who was able to do so much in such a short period of time, but unfortunately he lived too fast, and he, quite frankly, lived a very short period of time due to his own actions. Well, that was depressing, wasn't it? All right, let's get into a little lighter side of things. The One Man Gang! One Man Gang, formerly Akeem the African Dream, left the WWF in October of 1990. He had a short stint with WCW in 1991, and then eventually would return in 1995 through 96 as a friend of Hogan to become part of the Dungeon of Doom, the random collection of monsters of the week that would fight Hogan and lose to him week in and week out and week in and week out. But But what many people do not know is that the one-man gang actually appeared in ECW in 1998, being one of the numerous monsters, see that theme again, that Spike Dudley would take down, which would also include Mabel and many, many others. So one-man gang, again, appeared in all three, maybe not been a major player in all three, but hey, the criteria was he worked in all three. That's what counts. So suck it, doubters. Carl Ouellette. This is a very interesting one. Carl Ouellette, the man now known as PCO, who is, I'm pretty sure, made a deal with Satan to keep his body the way it is to be wrestling at his age. Formerly known as Pierre of the Quebecers, even formerly known as Jean-Pierre Lafitte, the one-eyed pirate who stole Bret Hart's jacket, because someone wants Bret Hart's jacket. Started with the Quebecers 1993 with Jacques Rougeau. He would eventually break singles and become the aforementioned pirate, which was god-awful. He would run afoul of the Clique like many did. He would leave the company. He would go to WCW with Jacques Rougeau. They would be the Amazing French Canadians, because they can't say Quebecers, I guess. I don't know, legally. They would then go back to the WWF for a short run. Then Carl Ouellette himself would go to ECW and actually have a short run there, eventually losing to ECW World Champion Just Incredible. And then, as weird as it gets, as we reach 2000, both Carl Ouellette and Jacques Rougeau would go to WCW and join Team Canada, which of course was led by Lance Storm, had Mike Awesome without hair, Jim Duggan without logic, Elix Skipper, major guns because they had to find something for her to do, and actually included Carl Ouellette and Jacques Rougeau, actual Canadians in the group, so good for them. It was a very short run, as was Team Canada, but hey, it counts. Now this one gets a little technical. Now, I try not to use job work, I try not to use guys that didn't appear on television, but this is so close. This one is so close and so really intimate and intimate. What the hell was that? Anyway, very close and very interesting, so I want to use it anyway. Christopher Daniels. Long indie darling Christopher Daniels, the Fallen Angel, worked for the WWF in 1998 and 1999 as basically an enhancement talent, but he would do so usually not on television, on televised events. He worked as an enhancement talent, a guy on shows, and he was a guy that was on the road with them who was working a lot, but it was never a guy who was actually signed to a contract. He was never brought in and made anything beyond. He was considered at one point to be part of the Brood and was eventually replaced by Christian, but that's probably the closest he ever got to television. But he was still there for quite a while, to the point where, you know what, I'm counting it. He then would do a short, brief stint in ECW. Again, nothing of note, but he did appear for them. And then, and the greatest irony, the greatest heartbreak of all, he'd be signed by WCW. He'd be one of those guys that was signed by WCW right before they went out of business, including him, Kid Cash, Jason Jett, aka Easy Money, and Steve Corino, who never appeared on television, but guys who got signed right before things went to hell. Christopher Daniels is known for being in the match with Mike Modest, in which Scott Steiner came out and kayfabe broke one of their arms because he didn't like the match, and Scott Steiner was, even as a character, a raving lunatic. So yeah, that's another one. It's technical, but I'm counting it, so I don't know. Another one that appeared in all three, which if you look at it, it had to only happen in the 90s. You want to talk about weird duos that you're not quite sure how they ended up as well as they did. The Public Enemy. The Public Enemy was the first real homegrown act of ECW back in the day, being Flyboy Rocco Rock and Johnny Grunge, two, let's say, heavier guys, one of whom used to be more of a high flyer, but had sort of toned down his style and started doing brawling, and ECW promoted them as one of their first big homegrown acts. They would do very well for themselves, eventually getting signed to WCW in 1995. They would come in and basically their whole gimmick was no matter what they did, they put a guy through a table at some point. Wonder where they got that idea. Anyway, they would even win the tag team titles for a very brief run, and then they would get released. Now in 1999, the Dudley Boys were, as we didn't know it at the time, were essentially on their last stretch in the company. They were doing promos about how they beat every tag team in ECW except for one, which of course was the Public Enemy. They called the Public Enemy out, and of course this seems like a random promo to do, but of course they were free from WCW. They came in, they were immediately beaten by the Dudley Boys and then left again. Supposedly they burned some bridges and acted with more of an attitude. They actually got signed by the WWF, came in, and again, apparently had an attitude and got the tar kicked out of them by the APA. If you ever watched that, you're probably better off watching a car crash with a decapitation. You'll get less nauseous. And then we're gone again. But in a brief period of time, I mean, they worked for all three companies. And honestly, near the end, the ECW to WWF transition was a disaster. But again, they worked in all three. And again, this was only in the 90s, and it worked for the time, but it wasn't going to happen all the time to everybody. So it's just one of those interesting ones. I'm going to finish this episode out with a very interesting group of people that worked in all three companies and actually had more names than they were in companies. I'll explain. Ron and Don Harris are actual identical twins. They started in ECW in 1994 as the Bruise Brothers, and in 1995 were hired by the WWF to play two long-haired hillbillies who were managed by a pre-political Zeb Coulter, Uncle Zebekiah for all you old folks. They were called the Blue Brothers, Jacob and Eli, and the only way you could tell them apart was you couldn't. Now, that went about nowhere. They'd go to ECW in 1996, once again as the Bruise Brothers, but the WWF would come calling again in 1997, call them Skull and 8 Ball, take your pick on who's who, it doesn't matter. They would join with their cousin Brian Lee, who is now Chains, who would join up with Crush and form the Disciples of Apocalypse, a biker gang that was only implied to be insanely racist. They would last a little bit longer than DOA actually did, would eventually feud with the Legion of Doom, who would bring back Paul Ellering for Paul Ellering to turn on them and join up with Skull and 8 Ball for some damn reason, and then would be released in 1999. In 1999, they would again go over to WCW, where they would work as a team called Creative Control. Patrick and Gerald, which was a parody of Pat Patterson and Gerald Briscoe, who were the Stooges of Vince McMahon, who were already parodies of themselves. So they're appearing a parody of some respected wrestlers. I don't know. It went as well as you might think WCW went in 1999. Eventually, they would just drop the Creative Control thing anyway and become Heavy D and Big Ron, enforcers for Jeff Jarrett in his bastardization of NWO 2000. The two would actually become a pretty popular tag team, known for their finish, the H-Bomb, which sounds like a curse word in a very religious household, and would exist well through the company. They'd be in there in 2001 when the company went out of business. They were still around. Of course, they would go on to work for TNA, and at one point, one of them was really close to owning TNA, so that's interesting. But again, guys that went through the thing, they all worked for all three companies under different names and different times and different establishments. They were never going to be top guys. They were never going to be big names, but they were in a position where they could work all three companies in a time where very few people could really do that. So that's very interesting. So I just thought I'd share that about the Harris twins. Well, that's going to do it for this time. Until next time, this has been Exploder. My name is Dan. Have a good one.